Okay, welcome back everyone. Kate James is back. Isn't that great? She's going to talk about basics of attributes and relationships. So I will turn over to Kate.
Okay, so before I begin, I just want to say, in an example of how the beta toolkit is being constantly updated, some of the slides I'm going to show you show things that have actually changed since I took the screenshots, which was earlier this week. So I updated a few of them. I didn't update all of them. It doesn't affect the content of what you're going to hear, but it may look a little different, and I will make sure to update those before this presentation is posted on the RSC website. So, you might have heard me speaking earlier about domain and range, and perhaps you knew what that meant, and perhaps you thought I was speaking Klingon. So, if you didn't know what that meant, here you go. These are going to be some terms that I'm going to be throwing around throughout this presentation, so take note. The domain is the entity that the element belongs to. The range is the entity that a relationship element points to. We'll see some examples of this in future slides. Properties is the set of RDA elements, including relationship designators, as they're found in the RDA registry. So when you go to the RDA registry, if you look closely, you'll see the word elements used, but the elements are listed as work properties. Class is also registry terminology for an RDA entity. And high-level relationship is a relationship between two entities with no refinement on the nature of the relationship. So an example of this is related agent of work, and then a refinement of that relationship would be creator of work. So related agent of work is the high level, and creator of work is the narrower. So these are some definitions that you'll find in the glossary of the Beta Toolkit now. Some of them look familiar, some of them don't. So elements, this is the same definition that you would find in the original toolkit. We've had a little bit of trouble trying to figure out the right way to describe the toolkit that we were all looking at last week. Now we have two. So I'll try to keep to original, but if I say current, I mean the one that is not the beta. So element, a word, character, or a group of words or characters representing a distinct unit of bibliographic information. Then we have a definition for a specific type of element, an attribute element, an element that is expected to be recorded as an unstructured description. Here's a definition for the other type of element, a relationship element, an element that relates to entities. And these are the definitions that we have right now, but perhaps we want to keep thinking a little bit more about these while the toolkit is a work in progress. And we'll talk more about whether we think these are good definitions or not for all of these. So, in the original toolkit, things were organized according to attributes and relationships. The attributes are usually in one or two chapters, depending on which one it is. So, for example, work attributes are found in chapter 6 and 7. Relationships, which are also elements, are found scattered throughout the toolkit. So work relationships are found in chapters 17, 19, 23, and 25. Relationship designators, which we use with relationships, are in the appendices. And so we have to go a lot of different places to identify an entity using attributes and relationships. Then the only connection we have in the original toolkit to the RDA registry is a link on the Resources tab. In the beta toolkit, we have attributes and relationships together, which I think is very exciting, one-stop shopping, all listed. All the elements for the entity are listed at the bottom, that long list, and you can navigate from there. Relationship designators have become elements. So we'll see more of this later, but and they may have the same name, they may have a different name. For example, author is a relationship designator in the original toolkit. It's now an element. The registry labels, remember I was showing you earlier that has creator of work, that's a registry label. And the domain and range for the element are in the element reference section that Jamie showed you. That's at the top of the element page. You can expand and collapse. And that's going to be really important information to help you find things within the beta toolkit. So relationship designators, which I know a lot of people in this audience are very fond of. So don't be sad. They're now relationship elements. And you'll see how you shouldn't be sad. You should actually be glad in a few minutes. So, from designator to element. So, in the original toolkit, I've described them as kind of living in a no man's land. They're not attributes, definitely not. They're not properly relationship elements because they're not contained in the relationship element chapters. They're in the appendices way after several other appendices on such important matters as capitalization, abbreviations, initial articles, and recording dates in the Christian calendar. And I find that odd because relationships are one of the principles that governs RDA and are one of the two kinds of elements, and relationship designators are part of how we record relationships. So it seems very strange to me that we kept such an important thing in an appendice way after all of these other things. So one of the relationships that is in the current toolkit, and it's a relationship element, is creator, chapter 19. So a composer is a type of creator. Correct? We all agree. There's other types, but composer is definitely a type of creator. So, therefore, a composer is a relationship element. It seems so simple, and yet this seems like a radical concept to us now. And I suspect that there was one person, at least in this room, that understood this years before I did. And that's why in the RDA registry, sorry, I forgot my laser pointer. You can see here, this is the RDA registry view right now for composer. It shows up just under the work properties, just like anything else, like a proper element. And if you haven't figured out who that person in the room was that figured this out, this was Gordon Dunsire. And Gordon, afterwards, my husband will want to know how you can figure stuff out ahead of me. So I'm going to take an example of a relationship designator and show you how it's become a relationship element. So in the original toolkit, we have this designator, cadenza, parens work, which I know everybody loves, the parens. Here's the definition. And in the beta toolkit, we've made the cosmetic change of removing the parens. You can see the definition's a little bit different, but the idea is the same. In the registry currently for this designator, which again is an element in the registry, there's different properties that you can look at for an element. This is the the high-level canonical properties index. So you can't see the range here, and I wanted to show you this view because it has the definition in it. Unfortunately, there's not one properties index where you can see it all, but if you went to the object properties for cadenza work, you would see that the range was work. And these elements in the registry have a domain, may have a range, except for these kind of meta elements that are being just deprecated. An example of one of these would be source consulted, which I tend to think of as it's not really an element, it's just an instruction. They've been kind of in this nebulous area, but they've been deprecated. Don't worry, the idea is still there, it's just in a different form. Again, as I said, the range isn't here, but trust me on that. The ranges work. Since I have an entity in the domain and the range, this is a relationship element. If I looked at this in the Beta Toolkit, I would see in the element reference section that we have a domain and range of work, and I have an alternate label from the RDA registry, has cadenza work. And I think that this example nicely illustrates how domain and range work for this element. In the example, so I was explaining before, the domain and range values are given in a human readable form at the top underneath work. And then underneath it, they're given in URI forms. And the arrow is going from domain to range. So the range is like the target that the arrow points to. And just FYI again, for these examples, they're linked to information, they're linked to URIs in the OMR. So if that information changes, these will change accordingly. So relationships were another important part of the original toolkit. And they're now just relationship elements. And relationships have always been elements in the toolkit in RDA. So this really isn't any different, except it's a little bit different wording for the same concept. In the original toolkit, relationships were refined by relationship designators. So you had the relationship owner, and then it was refined by the designator former owner. And remember, relationship element is relating to entities. So here we're going to see how a relationship creator is now a relationship element in the Beta Toolkit. So I've given you the original creator. The Beta Toolkit is creator of work. Notice there's some slight differences here. So in the original toolkit, we say that it's a person, family, or corporate body. In the Beta Toolkit, we say that it's an agent. Now, there's 3 different types of agents: person, family, or corporate body. So we're still saying the same thing. We know all of these different entities can be a creator, so we've just made it a little bit more succinct. So in the registry, by the way, there are agent properties. You won't find separately listed person properties, corporate body properties, because they're all types of agents. So anyway, remember, this is the work properties for the element creator. So the range is given as agent, and I've shown you here both the domain and the range because we're in the work properties set. So because I know I have 2 entities in the domain and the range, I have a relationship element. So then if I look at this same element in the Beta Toolkit, I'll see that I have a domain of work, a range of agents, alternate label will come from the OMR, has creator of work, and I have all 4 recording methods available to me. So how is this different from how it's used in the original toolkit? One is that I now have an additional recording method available to me. I can use an unstructured description. In the original toolkit, this was very strange. For relationships between the WEMI entities, you could use an unstructured description, or as we sometimes like to say, note. But you couldn't do that for relationships between agents in the WEMI entities, even though we all know you could certainly say David Copperfield has author Charles Dickens. It's a perfectly understandable, useful way to express that relationship, but it wasn't explicitly allowed in the original toolkit. So now it is explicitly allowed. The domain has been added to the label, so instead of creator, it's creator of work, and that's to make it unique from a new element. And it can be used like a relationship designator if more specificity is not wanted. So if I don't want to say author, if I just want to keep it the level creator of work, or perhaps I don't know what kind of creator I have, then I can do that. So, and I know that this has been a big issue when trying to apply RDA to our real-world cataloging practices, because in the ideal Ferberized world, you don't need to explicitly say creator because that's already part of the value for the element. But when you're putting into a less sophisticated system, it's very useful to explicitly say creator. So now you have that specific permission if you were worried about that. And before I go any further, I just wanted to talk about, I mentioned that they've made some changes between creator and creator work. There's a handout that you have underneath the Where Do You Find Examples called Where Did It Go? So this Where Did It Go handout gives you a list of some elements from the current toolkit to where you would find them in the beta toolkit, and a very brief reason about why. Sometimes it's a very important reason, like because of the LRM model, and sometimes it was, as Gordon explained, there's trouble with apostrophes, and so it's easier to say publisher's name. Easier to say publisher or name of publisher than it is to say publisher's name. Sorry, publisher is a different element. They get a little confusing. But yes, publisher's name became name of publisher. So this is not an exhaustive list of where things went, but it's the things that we could think of that were important and we thought might like to look at, help you find things in the new toolkit. Though it's still a work in progress, so there might be more updates and changes to come. This gives you an idea of where we're going. Okay, so attributes from the original toolkit. This gets a bit more complicated. We have some attribute elements, and we have some relationship elements, depending on what it is. So first we'll talk about the easier case, from an attribute to an attribute element. The original toolkit never explicitly defined attribute, and perhaps because that was explained in the models upon which RDA was based, but you couldn't actually find a definition there. But we knew instinctually what it was from how it was used, right? We knew it was an element, and we knew it was not a relationship. So an attribute is an element. In the beta glossary, it's defined as an element that is expected to be recorded as an unstructured description. But there are several elements that are listed as attributes under the list of elements for the entity that use all 4 recording methods. So if you look under person and you see attributes, one of the attribute elements that you'll see is language of person. So I'm wondering, this is a little bit confusing to me because I know I can record language of person using an identifier or a term from a vocabulary encoding scheme. So is it an attribute element? I think it is, but I'm wondering if the definition should be changed a little bit, or if you agree, let me know. So I have a couple of definitions to suggest: an element with no range, and an element that does not connect to entities. And there's also the idea that maybe it's not so important anymore to say what kind of element we have. Maybe it's enough to know that we have an element, and we can talk about that too. So here's an example of a current attribute, profession or occupation, that in the beta toolkit is profession or occupation. So not always a big change there. Yay. Still easy to find. So again, the definition's very similar. If you went to the element reference section for this element, you would see that there's a domain of person, and there's no range for this element. It has the alternate label, profession or occupation, and then this is one of the things that we're still working on. In the recording methods section for this element, it only lists structured description and unstructured description, but if you go down, you'll see that there's instructions for all 4 recording methods. So again, we're still working on it, and so one day we'll have that synced up, or perhaps we'll, streamline that so that information only appears in one place. But as you can see, there's examples showing a couple of different methods, a structured description and unstructured description. So is it an attribute element? Well, it has multiple recording methods, whether it's 2 or 4, so it doesn't seem to fit its definition. So that makes me think, not an attribute. But I know it doesn't relate to entities because it has no range, so it doesn't fit the relationship element definition. So I'm not sure, but I know that it's an element, and that makes me feel good because I can use it to identify a person. So to go from an attribute to relationship element is a bit more radical of a change, and this happened because of the introduction by LRM of 2 new entities, nomen and time span. So they turned several attributes into relationship elements because we now had a range. An example of this: name of corporate body, title of work, date of birth. We've done further development of the place entity in the beta toolkit, and that's also turned some attributes into relationship elements. An example of these would be location of conference, place of death, and sometimes it's very obvious from the name of the element what 2 entities are in the relationship, and mostly that occurs with the high-level elements. So for example, I showed you the related agent of work element, that high level. We also took some elements that were in the current original toolkit as attributes and renamed them so things would be more clear. So date associated with person, if you think about it for a little while, you could probably realize, okay, date, it's not the fruit nutty thing, and it's not like I'm going out on a date, it's having to deal with time date, so it must be the time span entity. But isn't it nice to have it all clearly stated in the label for the element as related time span of person? Same thing with place associated with corporate body. It became related place of corporate body. And this has also standardized the element names So it's easier to search for them because you have greater predictability about what the name will be if you haven't already memorized all 1,800 of them. And don't feel bad if you haven't. None of us have, and probably most of us never will. So here's another example of one that might not be so obvious that it's a relationship element. Variant title for work in the original toolkit, it's an attribute. It's become variant title of work. Subtle change from for to of. You can see not that much difference in the definition. In the beta toolkit, has a domain of work. And here's how I know this is a relationship element. It has a range of nomen. So, and nomen is kind of a weird entity. It's one that we have trouble understanding, but yes, it's names and titles, basically. So, alternate label, again, from the registry. There's only one recording method available. That's the unstructured description. So, is this an attribute element or a relationship element? Well, if an attribute element only has the unstructured description, that seems to make me think, it's attribute-y, but then it relates to entities, so it's got to be a relationship element. And I'm not sure how much it matters anymore. Because when you look at the example and you see the label for it, it starts to seem very relationship-y, and it starts to seem more lengthy. I just invented that word. And, it is possible that you can have a literal in linked data for a value. So maybe it doesn't really matter whether it's an attribute or a relationship. I think that most properly it would be called a relationship element. So, from place associated with corporate body to related place of corporate body. We've had a slight wording change here. I know it's a relationship element. Even if I couldn't tell that from the label itself, I'm reassured by the element reference section that I have a domain of corporate body and a range of place. Now notice how there's more alternate labels here. There's the alternate label that you would expect with the verb, but there's also the former name that is in the original toolkit, place associated with corporate body, and I'll show you how this can be useful later on. And then other place associated with corporate body. So this one's a little bit wonky because what we realized with a lot of these other associated with elements is they weren't really anything. They seem to be used to say what it's not rather than what it is. So, for example, in this particular case, we had definitely, this is an element, place associated with corporate body, and then we seem to have two element subtypes, location of conference, and if you were to look at the instruction, you'd say, okay, I can definitely see how that's an element subtype, and it's got some very specific instructions. And then you look at other places associated with corporate body and be like, what's the difference between this and the higher level element? And the answer is it's really not any different. So this has been simplified. And the reason this might be important to you is because if you're wondering, where are those specific instructions that I would see in other places associated with corporate body, you would look at the element, related place of corporate body, and obviously they've changed a bit as the wording has changed, but the ideas are there. So we've got some examples showing a couple of different recording methods, again, structured, unstructured, and identifier. So I have multiple recording methods available to me. So that means, no, this really can't be an attribute. And it relates to entities, which is a surefire way to say this is a relationship element. before I talk about the relationship matrix, I realized that I forgot to put something in these slides, and I realized this while I was talking to you about examples earlier, an hour ago. So I just wanted to talk briefly about something that I think this room will be interested in, which is access points. Authorized access points, or as we might say shorthand, AAP, those occupied a weird place in the original toolkit. They were not elements. You could say they were a collection of elements put together in a string, but they were not elements. They were not in the element analysis table. They've become elements in the beta toolkit, and this is explained in the Where Did It Go document. And this is going to make life easier in a lot of ways. So yes, all of the pseudo elements, whatever they were in the original toolkit, the access points for work, for person, for family, for corporate body, those are properly elements. What are not elements are things like authorized access point for musical work, because musical work is work. So those were never elements in the original toolkit. The title of musical work was not an element. It was just special instructions for the element title of work. So you won't find these in the list of Where Did It Go, because again, authorized access point for musical work, it's not an element, it's an instruction for recording the element value for that special type of work, musical work. Okay, back to the relationship matrix. So the relationship matrix is available in the Resources tab. It's a lookup tool for the relationship elements, which, remember, a lot of the former designators are now relationship elements. So when you used to have that giant list in appendices I through M, that's been replaced by this, which includes relationship designators that are now elements, as well as relationships. It's in the pick list, and again, you won't find the oracle there. It's not that kind of a matrix. So there's a list, and there's lists of high-level relationship elements. Remember I said a high-level relationship element had no refinement. Underneath the entity, you'll pick the one that you want to use. So I've got a situation. I've got a person, Anne Rice, and I want to relate her to the work that has a preferred title, Interview with the Vampire. So I'm going to relate the person to the work. So I'm going to be looking for the relationship designator author of from the current toolkit. So I go into the relationship matrix. I look under the listing for person to work, and this is what I see. I didn't show you the whole list of things because it's too long to fit on this slide. But the important thing is, this is alphabetical, and you probably can't see unless you're in the front row, but it starts at academic supervisor of, and then cuts off at defendant person of, and there's no author of in here. Why is that? Anne Rice is a person, right? So I thought picking person to work would be the right thing to do. Where is it? Do we no longer have author of? No. We do. I just didn't look in the right place because I didn't realize what the domain of author of was. So I know a person is a type of agent, right? We've got 3 types of agent: person, family, corporate body. So the next time I'm going to go back to the relationship matrix and pick agent to work, and I'll see the listing of elements, and I'm going to get to author of. And if I wanted to go even further, if it was appropriate, I could. But in this case, it's not. It's just regular author of. So now I see that I've got author of here because the agent contains person, family, corporate body. So the matrix has actually taught me something. The matrix has taught me the domain of author of by my trial and error using the matrix, and next time I'll be a little bit smarter. So that's one way I can look for an element in the new toolkit. Another way is to use the entity list of elements. So if I had gone to the agent entity page, at the bottom there's a list of elements. And this is another thing it's changed a little bit since when we looked at the toolkit when I did these slides. It doesn't have agent : author of. It just says author of because you know it's agent because it's the agent entity page. That's a cosmetic difference. Doesn't affect how we would search. So if I know either the entire name of the element or just the first couple of letters, I can do a search for that and find it just by typing AUTH. I can find author of. So it's right there, circles in orange. Now the weakness of finding elements this way is I needed to know the domain, just like with the relationship matrix. I need to know that the domain is agent, and I need to know the beginning of the element name. I might not need to know the whole thing. This is a third way that I can search for an element. I can do a filter by element name, and if I search author, you'll see I get all the elements that have author somewhere in there, and it might be part of the name of the element itself. It might be in the definition and so on, but this gives me a nice list to choose from, and by process of elimination, since I have that bit of information, I can figure out which is the one I'm looking for, author of, and I didn't actually need to know that the domain was agent. I just needed to know that it was an element and have a word for the keyword search. Now, the author of isn't a good example because it's exactly the same. But let's say that the name of the element has changed. And I don't know what the new name is, but I know that the name from the original toolkit is type of jurisdiction. So if I did a phrase search and filtered by elements, I would get a couple of hits. Now you can see, or maybe you can't see because this is small, the second hit is for the element type of government. And I get a hit on type of jurisdiction because it's an alternate label. Remember I said sometimes the former element names will show up as alternate labels in the element reference section. So this was an easy way for me to find the former element by its new name, and I didn't even have to know an instruction number, nor did I have to know the domain and range. So I did have to have two things. I had to know exactly what the former element name was, and I had to have a listing for it as an alternate label. Not every former element is listed as an alternate label. It depends on how significant the change was. So for example, if you were to look at the element reference section right now for preferred title of work, you would not see a listing, an alternate label for, wait, did I say that right? If you looked at the current element in the beta toolkit, preferred title of work, in the element reference section, alternate label, there is nothing that says preferred title for work. At least there was not the last time I checked, but I don't think there is right now. So now that we've talked a little bit about how elements work in the new toolkit and the different types, I wanted to take a look at these definitions again. So we still have the current definition of an element that came from the original toolkit. And what I'm wondering is, do we still think that this is accurate? Do we still think that this really encompasses all what an element is, works, or have we gone beyond words and characters? And I don't know the answer to that question. I think this does a pretty good job of explaining what an element is, but I'm not sure if this is capturing everything as we moved more into a linked data environment. So we've looked at the definition of attribute element, which I said, again, doesn't seem to be accurate based on what we're seeing in different places, because we have elements that have multiple recording methods that we seem to consider attributes. So should we change the definition, or does it still matter to us so much what kind of element we have? Does it still matter to us if it's an attribute or a relationship? So I'll say it was never really, doesn't explicitly explain this in the original toolkit, but by process of elimination, if you look at how things are structured, the elements that you can use for an authorized access point or variant access point for an entity are always attributes in the original toolkit, not relationships. Again, seems a bit odd since they're both useful in identifying an entity, and we say all elements are equal. So since we no longer have that very hierarchical structure of we've got these elements over here that are attributes, and we've got relationship elements here, 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 and here. And the idea is that as we become more international, more flexible, we would have greater flexibility in how access points are constructed. Do we need to still be making this distinction? Or is it enough to say this is an element, we use it to identify an entity, we can use it as part of an access point. And the important thing is to know how to record that, that element, which we'll always find in the instructions. So, thank you. Any questions? We'll say we are, we're at 11:32 right now, so I don't want to prevent anyone from eating if they're going to have a blood sugar low. So how much time? How much time for questions? And do you want to step up to the microphone?
Okay, Adam Schiff, University of Washington. One of your slides made me wonder what the relation. You had a slide where you're showing recording of a place of conference, I think, or a place. It was a place of corporate body, associated with corporate body. What is the relationship now with recording abbreviations for places and access points and recording places as elements? Because I noticed you didn't record BC, you recorded British Columbia. Okay. Where in RDA we would have recorded BC.
Okay. So let me see if I can find that slide really quick. So sorry, don't look if you have problems with fast scrolling. Okay. Is this it?
Yeah.
There we go. Okay. So, all right. So, right. So, first, let me say, Adam is asking about recording an abbreviation for a place versus recording, I guess you would say, like the full name of the place. So as an element for the place, British Columbia, as Adam knows, the preferred name of place would be British Columbia. But then if you had a corporate body, which this one is the Provincial Intermediate Teachers Association. Let's say I was going to do an authorized access point for it, and I needed to put the name of the place in the authorized access point. In the original toolkit, I would do parens B period C period, because that's the abbreviation for British Columbia. Okay, so you might not be able to see this, but the recording method here is unstructured description. So that means I found it in a resource, and this is how it appeared. And so that's how I recorded it. And anything wrong with that? Do we not know where this is? Do we not understand? Well, maybe we don't. I mean, Americans are terrible with geography. I'm assuming you Canadians know, but you know, is this a perfectly good way to identify this place, this instruct? Yes, and you have a lot of flexibility now with not only how you record the value of the element, but what value you might want to put in the authorized access point. So, again, I see no reason why you couldn't have used British Columbia as part of the authorized access point for this corporate body. I also see no reason why you couldn't use B period, C period. I think it might be kind of wonky to use an IRI, but you know, there's a lot of flexibility for local agencies.
Just one point. You never define attribute.
Right.
You just say what to do with it. So what the hell is attribute? What does that noun mean? It might be nice to know what that noun means.
Right.
Just take it out of the OED.
So, well, we'll say, I'm sure that the Oxford English Dictionary has a definition of attribute. What I am not sure about is, does the Oxford English Dictionary define it how we would use it within the context of RDA? About not exactly. No, exactly. I don't know either, because it was never defined in RDA. So can I take that as a vote for it doesn't really matter what kind of element it is? All we need to know is that it's an element? So.
Doesn't tell me anything. Speaking of what kind of element it is, I'm Lizzie Bass from Minitex. I have a comment, sort of question about the definition for element that you displayed. The one you showed says it's a word, character, or group of words or characters to describe that refers to a distinct unit of bibliographic information. But the element itself is the information, and you've got it defined as the label. The word or character, or group of words or characters is the label for the element, but that's not the element itself. So my question is, why was it defined that way, and can we change that?
Okay, so the question is about the definition for element, because it doesn't really seem to be defining what an element is. It's defining how the label for the element is. And that's not exactly the same thing. So can we change this? No. That's why this is a work in progress. So yes, can we change this? There are people in this room who are listening, and I'm sure taking note of this. And yes, I believe that I do not have the power to say, yes, this will be changed. I'm just the humble RDA examples editor. But I can tell you that, yes, we are at the stage where definitions can be changed, and RSC members will take that under consideration. And I can also say to you that personally, I agree with you, which is why I threw this out here, because I think that we've gone beyond this idea for an element. So, Thurston, oh good, Thurston's tall enough to reach the mic. So.
I am a student. I wanted to ask a question about the alternate labels given. I noticed, for example, if you take author of, the alternate label for that is author of, and that seems to be consistent with the form of label that you get in the RDA registry itself. Is there any intention that one form of label is preferred, or is it simply the case that either is acceptable, and is it deliberate that the alternate form of label is the one that you would find in the RDA registry?
So the question is about alternate labels. Thurston's pointed out that there's several cases, and in fact, anytime there's an element in the RDA registry that has a label there, you should see it listed as an alternate label in the element reference section. There might be some others, but the registry label will definitely be there. So the question is there a preference, whether to use the alternate label or to use the label that you would see up at the top, which might look the same except for there's no verb in it. And is this intentional that it's in the alternate label?
Well, in terms of having that alternative label, I can see it's useful for purposes of searching, but in terms of presenting data and expressing a relationship.
Okay, the master of the registry wants to answer this question because he doesn't trust me, so I'll allow him to do so.
I do trust you, Kate. I'll cover all of these questions. I think the definition of element may come from ISBD. I have a feeling that we didn't define element in the current original toolkit.
No, we did.
We did.
The definition is the same.
We haven't examined these definitions. We're still, as I said earlier, looking at all of this stuff for clarity and consistency. And I can tell you right now that looking at this definition, I totally agree with the comment from the floor. And really, the definition should be a distinct unit of bibliographic information. That's it. Okay. It'll take 30 seconds to change this, and we probably will. So I don't know when the next update of the content will be. Probably Monday morning or Tuesday morning. You may very well find that these definitions have changed. And I want to emphasize the point that this is exactly the kind of feedback that we want during the beta thing. This is useful stuff. And so we will change this. The word attribute currently only appears in new text of the toolkit in that list of elements associated with an entity. And we broke that list up because under manifestation it's 280 items long, etc. We broke it up into 4 categories to make it easier to navigate. And then we talked to our design people, and they said, actually, there's a better way of doing it, and you've seen that, the type ahead. So we're still thinking about whether we're going to use those categories or not. Some of us think they're useful, others do not think that they're useful. So the definition of attribute is actually based on nothing but that category, okay? If we remove the categories, attribute will disappear from the toolkit. Okay, so this is beta. I just have to keep reminding you, this is beta. It's going to change, and it's going to change, we hope, in the direction that's going to be useful for everybody. Thurston's point is actually the most interesting of the 3 questions that have been asked. Currently, we've only been thinking of putting in these alternate labels to help to find out where it went, okay, in the glossary. But there's another presentation to be made, and some of this is going to come out in the discussion on MARC and RDA on Monday. I strongly advise you to attend that because a lot of this stuff is going to come out there. Currently, these element labels are recorded as the data, say, in a marked record. So currently, the element will be recorded as creator. And we've changed it to creator of. So you can tackle this issue in a number of ways. And this has been done before. This isn't the first time we've changed element labels. You can do a retro conversion on a straight string match. You can go through your entire mark corpus and change creator to creator of. That's one method. The other method is just to leave it as creator. But then we have to provide a mapping between the old term and the new term. And that's partly what we have with the alternate labels. But where we've changed just one word, the preposition from for to of, we haven't put that in as an alternate label because it doesn't help to find out where it went, because when you look at the glossary, it's actually in the same place. What we haven't considered is the needs for retrospective conversion. And so I'm taking this is a big message, that we probably need to go through and use this device to provide ways to keep your legacy data compatible with the new beta data so that you don't have to change anything. And one of the important things here is all of these elements have unique labels. There are no two labels the same. And this means that they can substitute for an identifier or an IRI in your data. They have a one-to-one correspondence. So I think what we're going to take from this conversation is we'll go back and look at the impact of putting in many more alternate labels. Clearly, one impact will be the glossary will get bigger, and you're going to get strange juxtapositions. Creator, access point for work, C access point of work, you know, the next entry. And it's also going to increase the number of things that are in element reference. So we'll have to look at the impact of doing this, but there's clearly a use case being established here to match legacy data with new data. And so we'll definitely take that one on board as well. So that's been a great feedback session. 3 actions, 3 questions, 3 actions. It's great. It's lunchtime.
Oh, Gordon, I think Thurston had maybe one other, or maybe I misunderstood. Is there any preference for libraries about using PAS, creator, work?
No. As I said, every label is unique. Now, we're going to have to look at that statement because we have to double check. Maybe we've created a duplicate label in changing a label. I don't know. We're going to have to double check this, but it's very easy for us to do this. So we would prefer you to use the official, it's called the preferred label in RDF in the registry. But if the alternate labels are all unique as well, it doesn't really matter which one you use. In linked data, of course, you would not be using the labels at all. You would be using the IRI, and you then overcome all sorts of other problems, like what about translations of these labels?
Well, instead of using the word alternate label, you could say perhaps equivalent label or some such scenario.
Yeah, we're using a lot of the problems here, and Kate alluded to this, is that the world of linked data uses certain labels, and the library world uses certain labels, and sometimes they coincide, and sometimes they clash, and these are instances where they clash. So, and we've been looking at this for a couple of years now. There have been some papers circulating within RDA about terminology to overcome this problem. So we're on the case, and we're just looking for the most effective way of resolving this and making it easier for them. So, yeah, we can label things any which way we want. So, yeah, we could call them equivalent labels.
Okay, let's break for lunch, everyone. Try and be back by 1 o'clock. And thank you.
Oh, just one other. If you didn't get the handouts, we have some extra copies up here that you can take if you got missed somehow.
Thanks. You can leave stuff here. I will guard it with my life, I swear.